Well, welcome to day 3 of our post-fire landscapes. What are they telling us here for the state of Oregon? Thank you for being here. I think these are folks who are definitely going to be very locked and loaded and keenly interested in the subject matter this morning, which is how things move when they get disturbed. We're all kind of interested in that topic in general, I think. So I'm trying to be funny. It's probably not working at 8 this morning. The story of why things roll downhill. Yay. They do. Yay. It's physics. So I'm Cheryl Friesen. I'm a science liaison with the Forest Service. I work with the ecology program here in Oregon and Washington. I sit on the Willamette National Forest, and I serve the P&W Research Station as well. If you have any needs, if you're new to this here today, because I know some people are, find me or Sarah Wall. Sarah? Where is Sarah? She's hanging in there too, because we want to make this a quality experience for everybody. And hello to those out in video land, because we've been live streaming this as well the last couple of days. So without further ado, Bill Burns is actually going to be facilitating this morning for you all. And Bill, you want to come up and introduce yourself and move it along?
All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Burns. I'm from the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, also known as DOGAMI. Welcome to day 3 of Post-Fire Landscapes, What Can They Tell Us? An Oregon Post-Fire Research and Monitoring Symposium. So on day 1, we had great talks about climate change and forest impacts, and day 2, we got into the fire continuum and water and riparian impacts. And now here we are, day 3, where we're going to focus on post-fire soil effects and debris flows. And we're going to start with several talks on soil carbon and water repellency. Then we're going to follow that with several talks on debris flows, and then finally get into mitigation of these hazards. How do we do that? So let's get started with our first talk. I'd like to introduce Katherine McCool from Oregon State University. Come on up. We will get started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me at 8 to learn about soil. I know it's not the ideal time, but, we'll have fun. Sorry, I think it's coming up. Awesome. Okay. So hi, I'm Katherine. I'm a first-year PhD student at OSU Forestry. Today I'll be presenting my master's research, which focused on quantifying impacts of forest fire on soil carbon. And I'd like to thank my funders, Weyerhaeuser and OSU, as well as all my wonderful co-authors up here. So my main question I am asking is, how does severe wildfire impact carbon stocks, specifically in a young, intensively managed tree farm in the Western Oregon Cascades? Most of us know that carbon is very important, but fewer people know how important it is in soil. So here we have an image of some of the forest ecosystems based on their location and moisture regime. In the Western Cascades, we fall into this cool, temperate, moist area. And so when you look outside, see all these amazing Douglas firs, overstory and understory plants, that actually has about 1/8 the amount of carbon that is held below ground in the soil. So understanding how this soil carbon changes after fires, disturbances, is very important for both the global carbon cycle and also site-specific carbon. There are a few post-fire soil effects, or effects on soil, that most of you might know, but I'll just go over them for those who don't. The main thing we see is the combustion of the forest floor layer, and that's that organic, rich, fluffy layer on top of the soil that often drops after a fire. This leads to release of soil carbon and nitrogen. Also, that happens from burned out roots. Then we also see wind and water erosion, either immediately after the fire or long-term after the fire, and I think we'll learn more about that in the debris flow talks later. Lastly, we have a change in soil structure. We can have either an aeration or a collapse of soil structure. So it's kind of a mystery what happens after fires. A bunch of different things can happen. In this talk, we'll mainly be looking at soil carbon. We see a lot of these effects can be even more pronounced or a little different in industrial tree farms. So industrial farms, especially in the Western Cascades, are on the west slopes, so they can often have this more severe slope, which can lead to more erosion. We also see that the even age structure of many of the stands, especially if they're young stands in this case, can lead to more continuity of fire. Lastly, the presence of down woody biomass from previous harvests can lead to more smoldering that can penetrate even deeper into the soil. Here's a diagram of what we'd expect in the soil, pre-fire on the left, and post-fire on the right. We see in the Western Cascades, these soils are so deep and effective that we don't see much runoff. Most of it infiltrates into the soil and stays there. However, after the fire, as we see on the right, we see that soil drop that was characterized in the first day of these talks due to that combustion of the forest floor layer, so the tree can actually be suspended on its roots, many of which are killed in the fire. We also see that a hydrophobic layer can occur. In this site, it did occur about 7 centimeters deep, so in that case, all the infiltration we have before is now runoff. This, in combination with that lack of the forest floor layer, can lead to much more water erosion that can carry carbon from the site and into downstream waterways or other places. So my particular site was located in the very southwest corner of the Holiday Farm fire. The fire blew up, is this a pointer? Oh yeah. This whole area happened in about just 24 hours of this fire. So this happened just after that, but it was still a very high severity burn. And this map characterizes in terms of soil burn severity, which we looked at in this case because we're looking at soil. So this particular project is a continuation of a project established by my 2 committee members in order to measure the changes in soil carbon before and after a harvest. So they looked at soil carbon changes throughout 9 sites in Western Oregon and Washington. And then, so they had their initial samples in 2010, harvest in 2011, and then 4 years later, after planting new Douglas fir seedlings, they took their post-fire samples. And then either, beneficially or bad, one of the sites burned. So we had this great pre-fire data that we could compare with the post-fire data. So then that fire was in 2020. We started sampling in about December 2020 and then continued until April 2021. Here are some photos of the site. So you can see the site is roughly bordered by this road here. And so this is 4 months after the harvest. You can see there's a ton of that woody debris left on site, and this was left on site mostly in place. A bit of it was piled, but it was mostly left there in order to create that really rich forest floor layer. Here we see 6 years later. You can see a lot of that woody biomass has now integrated into the soil, but we still have some pretty large pieces of trees there. And then we also have, at this point, the seedlings were about 5 years old. And then, immediately after the fire, it's clear that this was a very high severity fire in terms of both soil and trees. We had 100% tree mortality. Most of the needles were totally blown off, and the soil was completely charred at all points. So in terms of our methods, we looked at about 120 points of both the forest floor and soil collection. So that led to forest floor, which is just mostly needles and char. There wasn't much else before you hit mineral soil. Then we looked at the 0 to 15 and 15 to 30 centimeter mineral soil cores. We also sampled all above ground biomass in order to estimate the amount of carbon both on the site and all of that carbon that may go into the site over time. So this required measuring every log and stump on site, and as you can see, there's a lot of those. Okay, so here are our results. And so on here we have our carbon stock, and then this yellow is the pre-harvest sample. Blue is post-harvest, and our red square is post-fire. And these significances refer to the period before it. Oh, sorry, wrong button. So this significance, refers to these periods, and this one refers to these periods. So we see between the two harvest periods, there was a giant increase in soil carbon and in the forest floor. And we can expect this. Remembering the photos we just looked at, we saw that there was a bunch of above-ground biomass, and all of that was then incorporated into the forest floor. We also see an even more significant decrease from post-harvest to post-fire. We can also expect this based on the second photo we saw. All of that forest floor that was built up and so productive, once drying out, was just completely the most flammable thing. And so we had almost a complete eradication of that forest floor. Now moving into our soil, we see that there is not much of a change in soil carbon in either the 0 to 15 or 15 to 30 centimeter periods between the pre and post-harvest periods. It's been shown in some literature that soil carbon doesn't change much after harvest, and we see that here. However, we do see a decrease in soil carbon after the fire, all the way down to 30 centimeters. And this is pretty significant because we know that soil is a very good insulator. It doesn't like to transfer heat far down. So we see significant changes in soil carbon all the way down to 30 centimeters. That shows us that something is going on here, whether it's the fire severity, something on site, and so we'll look into that a little later. But first, to quantify these losses, it's about 55 megagrams of carbon per hectare. This is equivalent to almost 40% of the total amount we measured down to 30 centimeters. Most of these losses were in the forest floor, which was decreased by about 95%. 30% of these losses were in the mineral soil, which is still a significant amount for mineral soil. This was overall about a 15% decrease. In terms of our above-ground biomass, we initially intended to compare these with the post-harvest sampling, but because of differences in sampling, we weren't able to. So this is just the amount of above-ground biomass that we measured post-fire on site. And so these are split into legacy harvests and the most recent harvest and trees. And we see on the left here is our mass, and on the right is carbon. And so as we expect, woody biomass is about 50% carbon. And then overall, the amount of mass and carbon on site we predict is about 26 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And if we remember the 55 megagrams we just saw, this is less than half of the total losses of that soil carbon. So even if all of this was to go into the soil, as it probably won't, some of it will go into the atmosphere, we still would not recoup even half of the soil carbon losses. Also looking at the soil, we see that the soil, even after the fire, still has much more carbon below ground than above ground. So I know you aren't the folks to tell this to, but this is just a plea to consider soil because it's important. So now we'll look into some of the reasons why this site might have seen such severe effects on soil carbon. Many previous studies have not seen decreases to 40%, especially this far down. So we're wondering why. And so as many people covered in the first day, the fire weather was a driving impact of these 2020 Labor Day fires. So the site usually received about 2 meters of precipitation. It received over half a meter less by the time of the fire on site. This was combined with 32 days of no precipitation. Then we had our fire weather events of those east-west winds, as well as low humidity. And so it was an extreme fire weather event in a site that hasn't seen much fire weather. And so the reason this could be so severe is just because it was a severe event. Another possibility is the stand structure of this forest. So in a complex forest ecosystem, we might see less fuel continuity because these trees, the larger trees, are better able to adapt to that fire and repel that fire. However, when we see a young, in this case, 8-year-old, even-age stand of trees that are very dry from no precipitation and low humidity, that fire is able to carry very, very easily through the fuels, especially when it's driven by high winds, can just blow right down the hill and torch them all, which is what we saw here. This, combined with that presence of the down woody biomass that we saw on site, can lead to even more severe effects into the soil, because these piles are allowed to burn and smolder for a long time and then penetrate even deeper, which might explain those decreases we saw down to 30 centimeters. So what does this mean for the future site? Well, they replanted seedlings here. We can see that in 2021, in March. We see that there is still not much of a forest floor. It hasn't been spring yet, so plants, for the most part, haven't regrown. But this new seedling is going to have a tough time reestablishing without those nutrients that it needs. We also have no overstory, and on a west-facing slope, especially when there are events like the heat dome that happened only a couple months after, it might be very difficult for these trees to reestablish. We also saw for the first time this stream. It might have just been because we sampled in winter, and so it could have been a seasonal stream. But either way, we see all of this runoff is just right next to all of that severely burned soil and carbon. There's no buffer here. It's just right up against the most severe effects. So the remaining carbon that is on site in that above ground form may wash downstream, and it can have effects on the aquatic ecosystems, as we learned in those talks yesterday, or it can come down and affect drinking water to the communities like Eugene that are right downstream. So it's important to consider what happens on site in terms of soil carbon, as well as the effects it may have further. So to summarize, we had losses of about 55 megagrams of carbon per hectare, decrease of 38% on site, and as all of you know, we need more long-term soil carbon research. This site was, it burned, and we had pre-fire data, which is a rarity, especially with the absence of a lot of long-term soil. And we know that soil acts on scales much, much longer than above-ground biomass like trees. So we need to keep things like this going to see how the soil recovers in the decades, centuries after the fire, to see how this ecosystem will adapt. And that's all. Thanks.
We have time for a couple of questions. And if you could use the mics, that'd be great.
I'll just speak loudly.
Okay.
Do you have an estimate of how much carbon is lost to the atmosphere versus washes downstream?
The question was, do I have an estimate of the amount of carbon that goes to the atmosphere or washes downstream? And I don't. I know there's literature out there, I think, on estimates of the total amount that came from these fires. But yeah, that would be really interesting to look at.
Great master's thesis. That's a lot of data for this story. In terms of the biomass, the stuff left around on the ground after harvest, how does that compare to unmanaged forests? And so I'm just asking the question is if the presence of that biomass increased the depth of the perturbation to the soil organic carbon in these managed forests compared to unmanaged ones. Is that a potential outcome or conclusion afterward?
The question was, how does the forest floor, I think you were asking, and the down woody biomass compare to unmanaged forests? And I'm not perfectly sure. I only did my research in this area, but I think that it was probably a driver. I mean, if you have this piled on wood and it's fast-moving fire, it can smolder for a long, long time and cause even more severe effects. So I think if it were unmanaged and there were less down wood, probably it wouldn't have as much of an effect on the soil, but maybe it would have more of an effect on the overstory, There's no way to know, I guess, but that would be a great thing to look into also. Oh, yes.
Two-part question. Part one, can you make any recommendations to tree nurseries about planting stock if there's a loss of soil carbon in the top 30 centimeters of the soil profile? What advice might you give to tree nurseries to assure planting success? Part two, did you measure any bulk densities looking at soil compaction, trying to characterize macro porosity and micro porosity?
I'll answer the second question first. The second question was, did I look at bulk density or macro porosity? Yes, we did look at bulk density. It decreased from both events, which is rare for post-fire. Usually you see an increase. So we had some sort of, fluffing up of the soil happen. Didn't characterize macroporosity, but that's something I'm hoping to look into now because, yeah, it's a huge effect on those tree roots reaching that water and helping to grow. The first question was, do you have recommendations for nursery owners in how to plant their seedlings to ensure survival? And I guess just site selection. I mean, making sure those seedlings can be protected if there are any severe effects. I think there is research being done right now about soil carbon remediation in terms of like pyrogenic carbon being put in to help. So yeah, I'm interested also to see where that goes.
See them sitting by the microphone. Oh, and now I have a follow-up question. Well, first, bringing up the point about bulk density, I'm assuming that the change in carbon stock that you saw isn't just a result of you now have less soil in the 15 to 30 centimeter increment. But my initial question was how much. I'm assuming you saw a lot of heterogeneity across your 120 points. Were you able to, at least anecdotally, tell whether any of that how much that was driven by samples that were took under like a combusted log versus under an area that just had like fine slash?
Yeah.
Was the biomass driving the heterogeneity in the soil carbon change, do you think?
The question was the biomass driving heterogeneity in carbon change? Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. When we located points, we actually located 300 and had to find the bird PVC, which is very hard. So they're not in the exactly same place. But we did make efforts to, if it was on a log or anything like that, avoid that area just to make sure it was as comparable as possible. But yeah, that definitely could be an effect. I mean, especially in this site, we saw many like imprints of large logs that had been completely burned out. And so it's likely that the soil under that was compacted and could have changed it. But overall, we saw decreases in both mass and percent carbon, which are the two components of soil carbon. So we think that a lot of this soil blew off site or was eroded somehow, but also that the carbon character of it changed due to that heat of combustion. The question was about bulk density and whether the change in bulk density could be due to differences in sampling or other things like that. Yeah, that's definitely possible. The previous two periods, they had, hired crews of 15 people to go out and take these cores, which were also taken in the summer, which could change slightly. For this, it was just me begging people to come in the middle of COVID winter, so less ability to take those samples as well as possible. But yeah, it would be really interesting to look at the unburned comparison. And no, they haven't been back to this site or the other sites as far as I know. I'm not sure if it will be continued, but that's something I very much want to happen because, yeah, we need to have those comparisons.
Great. Thank you.
Great, thank you.